Hi, welcome back. We're here for Module 3, Curriculum and Instruction. We're going to be talking about curriculum selection. So let's go ahead and jump in. I'm here with Rochelle. I'm Lorian. And as we begin thinking about curriculum selection for your microschool, one of the important things to do is think about your philosophy and your model. Rochelle, how have you seen that play out in your experiences with microschools?
Well, I actually would go back to my homeschool days, even more than microschools, when my mom was choosing curriculum and decided to go with Abeka Books. She felt good about that curriculum. It was a Christian-based company. I think too, in microschools, when you're thinking about what is the feeling I want to have here? What is the overall, when you talk about philosophy and model, I think ultimately that comes down to what is the feeling we want to have in our microschool, and the curriculum has to align with that. And I would reflect that question back to you, as you've been in microschools and worked with lots and lots of kids. Is there an example of a time when you had a curriculum that you were like, this didn't align with what I was looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think over the years of working in education, there have probably been many. One that I ultimately came to like was Khan Academy. And initially, my experiences in my own homeschool with my children using Khan Academy weren't positive. I didn't care for the delivery of the instruction or really the mechanism for how Khan Academy worked. But over the course of using it for a number of years and ultimately using it in my microschool, I found that there were ways to adapt that curriculum to make it more palatable and useful in my microschool. And so I think that's a thing to consider is certainly there will be curriculums that we don't love or that don't serve us. And it doesn't mean that there's not value in that curriculum wholesale.
So it wasn't, and maybe we're spending too much time here, but I want to dig into it a little bit. In that initial dislike of Khan Academy, was it more philosophy or model that you were struggling with, or that didn't meet your needs?
Great question. Probably both. So okay. For me, I am a highly experiential educator. I believe deeply in ideas of experience-based learning, that we construct knowledge through our experiences. And Khan Academy really rests on consuming content and then demonstrating proficiency with it, which is not a very exploratory process. Mm-hmm. And so that was a real misfit for my philosophy and model of education. What I found was that there were ultimately ways to utilize Khan Academy with some adaptation that allowed it to work with my mission and model. And so thinking about mission and model, it is important to choose curriculum that are going to support your model and really help you uphold your mission. And I think that knowing and having clarity around what your mission is, what you hope to accomplish for your learners or have your learners accomplish, will really help you choose curriculum that's going to be successful in your microschool. What are your thoughts on that, Rochelle?
And I'll share this. I was homeschooled in the early 80s. My mom was a teacher. We used Saxon, Spalding, and Abeka. That was the curriculum that she used. And one of the things that I found both super annoying as a child and super powerful as adults, as I reflected back, was the idea that everything that we did, we had to have completely correct before we moved on. And so it would be like you have 2 pages of science or one section, let's say Saxon. You had one section of Saxon math. And so I do my math and then I take it and give it to my mom. She had the teacher's key and she'd grade it and hand it back. And then I'd redo the ones I missed and I'd hand it back and she'd grade it again and hand it back. And sometimes it was like an entire day of exchanges. And I had 4 siblings in homeschool at the same time. And so it was really laborious, but I also didn't move on without any of the concepts. So when I was introduced to mastery-based, competency-based curriculum that tended to be an online thing, like a virtual platform of some kind, digital platform, I was like, oh my gosh, this is how you do this without it being this whole back and forth. And I taught high school geometry and realized that the way that we do things in school with homework and tests is incredibly unhelpful in making sure we take in all of the curriculum and all of the information that we need, because you can get a 75% on something. And if you never look at it again, if you do that in all your homeworks, and then you take the test and you never address it, you continue to leave more and more of it behind over time. Mm-hmm. And so Khan Academy for me was one that I loved because of its ability to make sure that kids didn't go too fast. This is not like a Khan Academy, like we're just using this as an example. This is neither a pro nor con Academy video, but it is a really good example. And the reason I loved it was because it did that thing that my mom did, like it gave, but it was instantaneous. It was this instantaneous feedback. And so, so to your point, didn't always love the instruction for all of the kids, needed to find a different way to do that. But that really is like, for me, the model, if I'm running a micro school, is that competency / mastery-based learning is a foundational piece, because I think that kids need to have the foundation for moving from one level to the next in all of it to be successful long term. And so finding curriculum, like for me, I would use that. And to your point that we talked earlier, not all students are going to have all of their needs met by that, but to be able to say, okay, let's find this way to change, like, here's the foundations of why I'm choosing this. I'm now not going to force every kid into this if they don't fit it. But if I can get as many of the kids to fit into it fits them as possible, then I make adjustments for the one-offs where it doesn't fit a kid. And I think that's one of the things to be thinking about as you're looking at curriculum is where does it align with what my overall goal is, and knowing that most likely you will never find one that meets the needs of 100% of your learners.
Absolutely. And I think this actually has become a really interesting example of what we mean here by choosing curriculum that supports your mission and model. For you, this is a great example of competency-based curriculum that would really serve your model. And for me, I was using Khan Academy in partnership with another organization that required that I use that curriculum. And so I found ways to make it work in my micro school. But when I look for math curriculum independently, I think about ways that I look for curriculum that are going to have a high experiential component, because that is a value that I hold in my micro schools as being primary. So kind of knowing what's important to you and what your beliefs are about education and how children learn really can direct you towards curriculum that ideally will uphold your mission and model. And it kind of leads us really well into our next topic, which is that it's okay to adapt curriculum. I think there are some things to be cognizant of and to really think about when you set out to adapt curriculum. But as you mentioned, there are so few instances of the perfect curriculum, a curriculum that hits all of your needs and wants, and kind of being realistic about that, I think leads people to be open to a broader range of curriculums when they're assessing curriculums for selection. Mm-hmm. And knowing how and when to adapt curriculum is a really valuable skill. At least I found it to be valuable in my own micro school. What are some ways that you've adapted curriculum?
Shift the question, like, what are some reasons why you would adapt your curriculum? Like, I'd love to hear that. And it's like, I have a kid who has dyslexia. That's going to make my ELA choice in curriculum need to be really different. Like and so I am not a dyslexia expert. And so to be able to say, so I have all these kids, I have an ELA curriculum that I've chosen that aligns with my values and my model. And then I discover that this is not ideal for a kid with dyslexia. And I have I mean, there are statistics that say 1 in 5 students are dyslexic. 2 of my 10 kids are dyslexic. And so I go, okay, I'm going to start doing a ton of research about and figure out can I adapt this curriculum? Like, where are the pieces that there are gaps? Because sometimes the adaptation isn't a change in curriculum. It may be an additional resource, a supplemental resource that will close the gap in a curriculum, not necessarily change how it is. I think there are different, ways to adapt. And sometimes it may be taking away part of the curriculum, sometimes it may supplementing, and sometimes it may be an entirely different curriculum. And so understanding, and the most beautiful thing is, I think, again, we choose based on what we think, without knowing, especially if you've never done this before. And then if we're really awesome at this, we take each individual learner and go, does this work for them? And if it doesn't, what within my resources and within my possibility can I do to adjust it in order for them to be a little bit better served, or like way better served, and kind of go that route.
Yeah. And I think those are some really interesting points that you bring up, the most important of which is real willingness to experiment. Mm-hmm. We are kind of always in a position of guessing, even if it's a very educated guess, even if you have a background in education. In fact, I would say most educators will tell you they're going to make their best guess about what's going to work, and then they're going to tailor that guess to the actual outcomes that they're experiencing in their classrooms or in their learning environments. And so willingness to kind of experiment and say, mm-hmm. I'm going to try this and see what works, and reflect on how well it's working, and then alter it further.
It's tricky from the financial perspective. Like I think a couple of things. Most educators don't get to choose their curriculum. So that's one piece. I mean, most principals don't often it's like a district decision. So you could be, I live in a district with 60,000 students. So you could have literally no choice over anything you're using if you're in the schools. So there's even if you're coming into a micro school from an educator's perspective, you will have potentially opinions about curriculum, but you've never had a chance to choose. And then secondly, shifting mid-year, there are a lot of people that stick with known to them terrible curriculum, or not, whatever the word is in the spectrum of really terrible to really great, because they can't afford to shift midstream. The one thing that's exciting to me is that there is so much available for free now. So many resources. So if you're in a place where maybe the starting point is, what can I do for free? Like, what can I use for free that meets my needs? Because if you can start out with a very low cost in your curriculum, then anything you would have budgeted, you can then use to make the adaptations, to get the supplements, we hadn't talked about this ahead of time. And I really like this idea of go with free, because there is some really great stuff out there that's free. And then kind of move from there in meeting the needs of your learners.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable idea. And I would encourage people as well to look for what's already available out there for free, or what you already own. We will talk in a later section about kind of networking and sharing resources. There are some fabulous ways that you can maximize what you have available to you. But starting with resources that are free, both is cost effective, and it also gives you that freedom to experiment a little bit without the cost sunk fallacy, or the fallacy of cost, sunk cost, the fallacy of sunk cost. And the other thing that is helpful is that as you experiment with a free curriculum, you will learn a ton about what works, what you like, what you don't like, and you can always keep adding to a free resource. So as we think about adapting curriculum, I will take, again, our example of Khan Academy. And you had said, how do you take a resource that's competency-based and make it more experiential? And Khan Academy is a perfect example, because a lot of times what we would do is pause in using Khan Academy and find ways to play games or work with real world materials. Just because a program is digitally housed and video based doesn't mean that you can't take those same concepts, experiment with them in real life, and then come back to the computer. So you aren't bound to always using curriculum in a linear fashion and that as its only source of
Totally.
instruction.
So one other thing I was going to say is, and I probably should have said this in the last slide, there are so many, it's almost infinite number of curriculum companies that exist. It can be very, very, very daunting. I think there are lots of people who are in this space that have curated lists and given their reasons, the pros and cons. So that just Google like best curriculum for micro school, and start to play around with not reinventing the wheel of starting with every available curriculum. I would say my takeaway from this part of the conversation is, in year one, if you say, I have a budget for curriculum and I'm going to start with free, you probably, in the use of free curriculum, you're going to be like, you'll figure out what you're looking for, and then you can go out and spend the money on that. But if you don't know that yet, you may spend money on something that you hoped to use for the next 3 years that actually doesn't suit your needs. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you think about adapting curriculum to suit your needs, I think one of the things to consider is how much time and energy resource will I have to expend to adapt this curriculum?
Yeah.
So free is wonderful if you find that you're adapting, you're spending 5 hours a week adapting that curriculum. You may want to run the numbers and decide, is it worth my time and energy to keep adapting this curriculum, or would I be better served spending some money to purchase a curriculum that is already doing this adaptation for me?
Yeah, totally. So one of the things to think about as we are walking through this is accountability. And I have been in environments where accountability is kind of a bad word, like a dirty word, because so much of what has happened in the traditional school environment is around accountability that doesn't ultimately serve children in learning. That does not mean that accountability is not like key and important. And so please don't disregard this accountability conversations because you struggle with the way accountability is done now, because we want to talk about ways that you can consider accountability that will align with your own personal values. So I'd love to just jump in with that for you, Lori, and what does accountability look like for you that aligns with your values?
I am so glad that you brought that point up. And as you know, I am probably one of those people who tends to think accountability is a dirty word. And it isn't because I don't want to be accountable to the objectives that I set with my learners. It's because often it has been misused, and it's about accountability to legislative ideas about education that don't serve my learners. So when I think about accountability in curriculum, I really think about, how will I know that this curriculum is serving my learners at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, whatever those kind of milestone markers are going to be for me? What am I going to use to assess the effectiveness of this curriculum? And how do I share my learners' education with others, whether that's their parents, whether that's with the learner themselves, or with other entities that want to understand how my students are learning in their learning environment. And I'm a big fan of portfolios. So we use a lot of portfolio-based accountability in my micro school. That means that when I look at curriculum, I'm really looking with an eye towards, how will I utilize this curriculum in my accountability? What will be the things that I'm able to capture from this curriculum and add to a portfolio? It doesn't mean that a curriculum like Khan Academy, that really is not portfolio friendly, is totally off the table. But if I think about what my end goals are, I can go into using that curriculum with real clarity around what I might need to do to utilize that curriculum in a fashion that is in alignment with how we will use accountability in my micro school.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing I want to add to this is this accountability piece comes down to, and there are accountabilities a lot of different directions. And you mentioned some of them. Parents, I would invite you to consider the accountability you have to the children in your micro school, because in almost every education environment, they don't have a voice, they don't have power, and they are last. And we say that everything is about them, but then so much of what happens is clearly not about them. And so this is a place where you go, how can I be most accountable to my students? And I know we're talking about curriculum specifically, so I'm inviting into that, but I'm also inviting into, generally speaking, when you think about your accountabilities, having your students in mind as your number one is going to bump against other people and is going to allow you to have the greatest impact on these like small human beings that are in your care.
I am so grateful that you said that. And I think that if people walk away with nothing else in thinking about accountability and curriculum selection, I hope that it's that, because as you pointed out, there will be times where the different components of accountability are bumping up against each other. But at the end of the day, if a curriculum is not serving the learners that you are using it with, it is not serving your purposes. And I hope that people will take that very seriously and really think about how that will look when there is conflict in the different ways that accountability can rub up against each other, and really look for ways to be in alignment with the students.
I love this, because there are a lot of people that will be in a micro school space that do not have experience in a classroom. Like I feel very strongly that that there are really valuable things that come with a teaching certificate and experience and formal experience in a classroom. And I think that those things are not necessary in order to be a really great facilitator, educator, person that works with children. So there's like two things are true in that for me. And so and again, I was a high school math teacher. One of the subjects that is the most terrifying for people who are, and actually, I know certified elementary teachers, lots and lots of them, that math is the most terrifying thing. They're in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, and they don't feel confident, which is super detrimental to the kids that they're instructing, unless they bring their kids into that non-confidence and they're like, hey, you guys, we can figure this out together. But it isn't like I'm not good at math, so none of us are going to be good at math kind of, So what I guess my point is, the decisions you make about the curriculum in the subjects that you feel the least amount of confidence, that you find curricula that will support that non-confidence and non-experience or lack of experience, that it is more like it's more fully formed. It's not something you have to like go in and build, that it's an open and go type of model or type of curriculum that will support you in that. And I mean, but once you're through year one, there's going to be a lot more confidence there, but definitely. And if you're the person who's organizing the micro school and not going to be the person that's in the room, understanding the skill set of the person that's going to be in the room and choosing curriculum that is, accordingly around that, I think is important.
Yeah. And there is such a range of curricula out there. There are curriculum that are fully scripted. It tells you exactly what to say and exactly what your student should say back to you, and then what to say in response. And that is not a cheat.
Sounds really boring.
I'm not. And so what's interesting is I'm not good at those curriculum. There's so much information and it's so scripted that I find that really difficult to deliver. But I know other people for whom that is so reassuring, that they don't have to think of how to present this topic. They don't need to know what to say or what their student should say back to them. And so there's both skill level, and there's also the kind of learner that you are as the educator and what is going to be most useful for you as an educator. Some other things to consider in this realm are how much time you have available, whether you are the person who's going to be operating your micro school yourself, or whether you're someone who's going to be implementing micro schools, but you aren't the educator who's kind of on the front lines. Thinking about what preparation time looks like, how much time will be needed to enact a curriculum, how much time is going to be needed to gather resources for a curriculum, are some things to really consider when you think about your curriculum selection and how that's going to be implemented, particularly for sole proprietors, those people who are operating a microschool by themselves. Really think about how much time some of those things are going to take you so that you can find a good balance between preparation, planning, and actual instruction time.
These are just some of the factors that we thought about as we were talking about this, and there's curriculum out there that is not inclusive, and if your worldview has inclusion a lot of different directions in, then paying attention to that is really, really important. And the impacts of trauma, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but the different ways that the different types of trauma, the different reasons for trauma that could impact your learners as you're coming into this curriculum. And then obviously the income level of your learners. Lorian, I'd love to kind of any additional thoughts on any of these three bullets.
Yeah, so I've had the opportunity to work with students and families from a really diverse range of backgrounds. And so I have just seen over and over again how much of an impact these other considerations can have, both in the choices you make about curriculum as well as the implementation of curriculum. And I think the one that most people are familiar with is income. Differing levels of income are going to bring different obstacles and different benefits to your microschool. So when I think about my microschools, I've operated a number of microschools now, and I've had other opportunities to work with learners where I've had people coming from different backgrounds. One of the things that I think is really important to consider is that you will absolutely encounter somebody who's coming from a different perspective than you are. And you can't know what you don't know. And that's okay. It's not that you need to know everything right now about every possibility or iteration that's going to walk through the door, but rather to be open to possibilities and really trying to put yourself in other people's shoes. With regard to income, some of the things that I've seen come up are really differing levels of economic stability and income in the families that I serve. So I have some families who are dual income earners, and they are working really hard just to make ends meet. And their kids are the first ones through the door because they need to get their child to school so they can get to work. And they may be struggling to pack a sufficient lunch for that child, not because they don't care, but because that's the situation that they're in. And that has impacts on emotional regulation. It has impacts on readiness to learn, focus. And then I have learners who are from really well-off situations who have the ability to bring in extra supplies or have a parent who can volunteer. And where that comes to play in curriculum selection is thinking about what's going to be necessary for actually implementing that curriculum. If you're reliant on your families to donate lots of materials or to donate time and energy, being aware of those disparities is going to be important. Another thing that can be a factor, and I've seen this both in my own microschool as well as working with other microschools, is if a family is experiencing transportation insecurity or housing insecurity, there can be really fluctuating attendance. And if your curriculum moves lockstep, where everyone's got to be on the same page before you can move forward, that can be a real barrier if you have a student that only comes to school 2 days a week on average. And while we'd all love to say the solution to that is just to make sure that they're at school, things don't always, those problems are not always that easy to solve. And knowing that that may be a population you're serving, if you're in an area where you think that's likely, taking that into account as you select curriculum is really going to be useful and serve you. The one thing I would say is just to really be willing to talk to people. Don't make assumptions about what their situation is, even if you think that you're really in alignment. I have seen over and over again, although I have a background in education, I've homeschooled my own children. And I've seen over and over again how you can have a group of homeschooling parents who think that they share the same philosophy and the same model and the same worldview. And then when you get down to the nitty gritty, you find out maybe we're not as aligned as we think we are. And so I just encourage people, don't make assumptions, be willing to ask and to share kind of candidly about what your thoughts are on something. Be willing to do your own due diligence. Just because someone else that you believe shares your philosophy or your model, says a curriculum is a good fit, be willing to research that for yourself. Because while it might be a great fit for them in their expression of Montessori education, it may not fit your expression of something like Montessori education. I'm using that as an example. But that's just something that I would really encourage everyone to do.